Chapter 2. The fine weather lasted over the late summer. In the middle of the day the bare rocks glowed with heat. The vapour rose from them, and the sea glittered, and the spray dashed white beneath the crags, in the places where it was never at rest. Olaf was up early in the mornings, but he did not go out upon the rocks now. He would stand leaning over the fence round the northernmost cornfield, where the path from the waterside came up. From there he could see down to the creek and up the valley, almost the whole of his home fields. But toward the Oslo fjord and southward, the view was shut in by a crag that jutted out and gave shelter to the last strip of arable land in Hestviken. Of the fjord he had only a glimpse northward, past the smooth skull of the bull and its shaggy wooded neck. Over on the other side lay Hudaheim in the morning sun, a low ridge of waste with sparse fir trees. The higher ground was tilled with great farms. He had been over there one day, but from here nothing could be seen of any dwellings. In the cornfield the rock cropped out in so many places that the pale carpet of stubble seemed riddled with it. Here and there a ribbon of soil between two brown rocks. But they often had good corn here. It was manured with fish offal from the quayside, and it ripened early. In the crevices of the rock grew a flowering grass that Olaf had never seen before. When he came hither in the early summer, it blossomed with fair purple stars. But now the grass itself was blood-red, and rust-red in all its fringed blades, and bristled with seed balls that looked like herons' heads with long beaks. The work of the farm was what Olaf understood best. He saw that there were tasks enough before him. The old meadows to be cleared of scrub, the herds to be brought up to their number, the houses to be repaired. He had hired Borne, Gudrid's husband, to fish and hunt seals for him in the fjord during the coming half-year. Of such things he had no experience, but he intended to go out with Borne this winter to gain a knowledge of the pursuits on which the ancient prosperity of Hestviken had most depended. Borne also advised him to take up again, next summer, the salt pans on the creek south of the Horse Crag. But behind his thoughts, which were busy with the work of the day and the work of the future, a deep, happy calm dwelt in Olaf's mind. His day flowed over him now like the stream of nothing but good hours. And since he knew that the dangerous memories lay sunk beneath this stream, and that it was only by virtue of a kind of strength that he was able to let them lie there in peace and not think about them, he felt at the same time proud that he was now happy and safe. He knew, in a clear and cool fashion, that the old disasters might return and afflict them. But he took the good days while they were there. So he stood, morning after morning, gazing and thinking of this and that, while this dreamlike feeling of happiness surged beneath his thoughts. His fair face looked hard and angry at times, and the black pupils of his eyes grew small as pinpoints. When he might expect Ingunn to be up, he went back to the house. He greeted his wife with a nod and the shadow of a smile when they met, and watched the little blush of joy that appeared on her healthy face, and the calm, meek happiness that beamed in her looks and bearing. Ingunn was so fair now. Never had she been fairer. She was a little fuller than of old, and her skin was shining white. Her eyes seemed larger and a deeper blue under the white coif of the wedded woman. She moved in a gentle, subdued way. Her manner had become quiet and simple. She was meek withal, but almost humble towards her husband. but all could see that she was happy, and all who had met Olaf's wife liked her. Olaf still slept but little at night. Hour after hour he lay awake without stirring, unless he moved the arm on which she lay when it was numb. She reposed so confidingly against him in her sleep, and he breathed in the sweet hay scent of her hair. Her whole being exhaled health, warmth, and youth. And in the pitch darkness it seemed to Olaf that the smell of old folk dwelt in the corners, overcome and driven out. He lay thus and felt the time go by, not longing for sleep to come. It was so good to lie like this and simply be aware of her presence. Now, at last, they were safely together. He passed his hand over her shoulder and arm. It was cool and soft as silk. The coverlet had slipped down. He drew it up, bending over her with caresses, and she replied from her drowsiness with little sleepy words of endearment, like a bird twittering on its nightly perch. But his heart was wakeful and easily scared. It started like a bird that flies up. He noticed this himself and was on guard lest others should see it. One morning he stood by the fence, looking at his cows, which had been let into the stubble field. The big bull was there. It was the only really handsome animal in his herd, massive and sturdy, black as coal, but with a pale stripe down its back. But as he stood and watched the bull striding along, slow and heavy, he thought all at once that the pale stripe on the dark back wriggled like a snake, and for a moment it made his flesh creep. It was only for a brief instant, then he collected himself. But after that he was never quite so fond of the bull as he had been, and this feeling clung to him so long as the bull was in his possession. While the summer weather lasted, Olaf was in the habit of going down to the beach daily during the midday rest. He swam out till he could see the houses of the manor above the rocks, lay floating on his back, and then swam again. Usually Bjorn bathed with him. One day, when they had come out of the water and were letting the wind dry them, Olaf chanced to look at Bjorn's feet. They were large, but high in the instep, with strongly curved soles, the sure sign of gentle birth. He had heard it said that it could be seen at once by a man's feet if a drop of blood from the old thrall stock were mingled with his. Bjorn's face and limbs were tanned brown as the bark of a tree, but his body was white as milk, and his hair was very fair, but much grizzled. The question slipped out of Olaf's mouth. "Are you akin to us Hestvik men, Bjorn?" "No," said Bjorn curtly. "The devil! Don't you know who are your kindred, man?" Olaf was rather embarrassed and said, "I grew up far from my own people. There may be branches of which one has scarce heard." "You thought maybe I was one of those wild shoots that had grown up after that foul beard," said Bjorn gruffly. "No, I am true begotten, and so were my forefathers for 7 generations. I have never heard that there were bastards in our stock." Olaf bit his lip. He was angry, but then he had himself provoked the man. So he said nothing. "But there is one fault in us," Bjorn went on. "It is as though the axe leaps up of itself in our hands when we are goaded, if you will call that a fault. And short is the joy that comes of a stroke, unless the hand that strikes have gold within its reach." Olaf was silent. Bjorn laughed and said, "I slew my neighbour when we fell out over some thongs. What do you think of that, Master Olav? I think they must have been costly thongs. Were they so wonderful? I had borrowed them from Gunnar to carry in my hay. What do you think of that? I think you to be such that I cannot believe it your custom to reward folk thus for a service, said Olav. So I think there must have been something rare and strange about those thongs, nevertheless. Gunnar must have thought I thought so, replied Bjorn, for he charged me with cutting off a piece of them. Olav nodded. Bjorn asked, bending down to tie his shoe, What would you have done in my place, Olav Audunsson? It is not easy for me to say, said Olav. He was struggling to get the pin of his brooch through his shirt. No, for no one would think of charging a man of your condition with stealing a wretched piece of thong, said Bjorn. But you didn't hold back either, Olav, when your honour was at stake. Olav was about to put on his kirtle, but he let his arm drop with it. What do you mean? I mean, when word came hither how you had served your brother-in-law for seeking to deny you the maid you were promised, and giving you foul words withal, I thought I could have a mind to do you a friendly office when you came home some day. But for that I would not have taken service so near the haunts where once I owned a farm myself, though it was not a great one. Olaf was putting on his belt. He unfastened the dagger that hung to it, a good weapon with a blade forged by a foreign armourer, and a plate of silver with a hook to hold it to the belt. He handed it to Bjorn. Will you accept this as a token of friendship, Bjorn? No. Have you never heard, Olaf, that a knife is not a gift between friends? It cuts friendship asunder. But you must do me this friendly office. You will cease giving to the wife, who is here ever and anon. Olaf blushed. He looked very young for the moment. To hide his embarrassment, he said lightly, as he leapt onto the rock and began to walk up, I didn't know that they knew so much hereabouts of what has been between the Steinfinnsons and me. Bjorn had given him a start with what he had said about being quick of hand when honour was at stake. The slaying of Einar Kolbeinsson had been far from his mind. It weighed so little on his spirit, except as the cause of the difficulties from which he was now free. So it had not occurred to him that Bjorn was alluding to that. Olaf had taken to Bjorn when he came and offered him his service, and he continued to like him. But he saw that the man had an ill report in the neighbourhood. His wife, Gudrid, came down to Hestviken at all times. Bjorn showed little joy at meeting her, and he seldom went home. Olaf soon found out that she was the most arrant gossip, who preferred to roam from house to house, mumping with her wallet, rather than look to her home. Nor were they so poverty-stricken over at Rundmere as she pretended. Bjorn took better care of his own than Gudrid gave him credit for. He sent home both meat and fish, and a little meal, and they had cow and goat. But Olaf had once called the woman foster-mother, so she never went from him without a gift. Now he was sorry he had put himself in this difficulty. He guessed it must be intolerable for Bjorn, when the man was to be chief of the serving men at the manor, and his wife came and accepted alms in this way. A desire had come upon Olaf to associate with older men. Without his knowing it, he had felt the want of someone who might have cared to teach him, and be a guide as he grew up. He was now very courteous and respectful toward all old men among his equals, and helpful to the aged poor, received old men's advice patiently, and followed it too when he saw that it was beneficial. Moreover, Olaf was himself a man of few words when he came among strangers. But old folk could usually succeed in keeping the talk going, without his having to say much for his part, or to listen the whole time. So they thought very well of the young Master of Hestviken. Nor was he ill-liked among those of his own age, though they thought it could scarce be said that Olav Audunsson brought mirth and gladness with him, and some mistook his quiet and silent manner for pride. But others thought that the man was only somewhat heavy of disposition, and not too keen-witted. That Olaf and his wife were uncommonly fair to look upon, and knew well how to behave themselves among folk, all were agreed. One Saturday afternoon, about the time when the work ceased, Olaf and Bjorn, with both the housecarls, were coming up from the waterside, when they saw a company ride out of the little wood at Berndal, and go up the slope toward the manor. There were 2 young men and 3 young maids, whose flaxen hair floated freely down to their saddles. Their gowns were red and blue. It was a fair sight on the meadow, which was still fresh and green with the aftergrass, and Olaf was glad when he recognized the daughters of Arn. He took them in his arms and kissed them with a merry greeting, as he helped them from the horses, and then he led them forward to his wife, who stood at the door and received her guests in her quiet and gentle way. They had not been to the homecoming feast, and during the holy days the 2 younger were to go home to their father. So the priest had sent them hither that they might bring greetings and gifts to the wife of their kinsman. The priest's housecarl accompanied the maids, and as they rode past Skikjostad, the son of that house came and offered to join them. He had spoken with Olaf the week before about a bargain. Olaf went over to the loft room, changed his sea clothes, tidied himself, and put on his Sunday garments. He was glad to have these young kinswomen in the neighbourhood, so Ingunn would be less lonely. He had heard a rumour that Sire Benedict and Paul of Skikjostad were thinking of a marriage between Signy and Bard Palsson, and it looked as though the 2 young people were not disposed to gainsay the matter either. Indeed, it might be a comfort to them at Hestviken too, if this bargain were made. Outside the weather was still and cold. The pale, clear air was a sure presage of frost at night. It was cold indoors too. Much wood was thrown upon the hearth, and after the household had been fed, the young people were minded to play in the courtyard a while, till darkness came on to warm themselves. But Ingunn would not take part in the game. She sat with her cloak wrapped about her, and looked as though she felt the cold. She was so quiet that something seemed to have depressed her spirits. Seeing it, Olaf left the dance and seated himself by his wife, and soon after it grew so dark that they all came into the house. It then appeared that the 3 sisters knew many games, riddles, and jests, which were fitted for indoors, and they had sweet voices when they sang. In everything they were courtly and well-bred maidens. But Ingunn remained in ill humour, and Olaf was not able to enjoy himself fully, for he could not guess what ailed his wife. Olaf put his arm about Torun and led her to Ingunn. Torun was not yet 13, a fair and merry child, but not even she could thaw the mistress of the house. In the evening Olaf accompanied his guests on the way. It was fine weather. The full moon shone brightly in the clear sky, but the frost was beginning to creep in from the fjord, blotting out the shadows. Olaf walked, leading Torun's horse. "Your wife doesn't like us, Olaf," said the little maid. "Can you think that?" said Olaf with a laugh. "Not like you? I don't know what has gone against Ingunn tonight." Ingunn was in bed when Olaf came home. and when he lay down beside her, he found that she was weeping. He stroked her and bade her say why she was so sorrowful. At long last he got her to come out with it. She felt so mortally unwell. It must come from her having eaten some shellfish when she was down by the waterside that morning. Olaf told her not to do such things. They could speak to him or to Bjorn if she had a mind to such food, and they would find her some shellfish that was good to eat. Then he asked if she did not think his kinswomen were pleasant and comely maids. Ingunn answered yes. "And merry indeed were these daughters of Arn," she said in a tone of disapproval. "And you sported right wantonly with them, Olaf, utterly unlike you. I can guess that you like them." "Yes," said Olaf, and his voice was filled with gladness at the thought of the mirthful evening. It would be a great comfort to them both that he had these blithe and courtly young kinswomen so near at hand, he said again. Olaf could hear that she was breathing heavily. After a while she whispered, "Were we not as sisters to you, Tora and I, in your boyhood? I don't remember that you romped and jested so wantonly with us." "Oh, maybe 'twas not unknown," replied Olaf. "But I was under another man's roof," he added quietly. "Had I grown up among my own kindred, and in my own home, I think I would have been less grave and silent as a boy." Soon after he heard that she was weeping again. And now her sobs took such hold that he had to get water for her. On lighting a splinter of wood, he saw her face so red and swollen that he feared she had eaten something downright poisonous. He threw on some clothes, dashed out, and fetched fresh milk, which he forced her to drink, and then at last she began to mend and fell asleep. One day, just before Hallowmass, Olaf was at the manse together with certain other franklins. They had come to have letters drawn up by the priest. Olaf had, well, not exactly fallen out, with another man named Stein. But yet the two had exchanged words somewhat sharply once or twice. As they were about to ride home again, some of the men went out to look at Applevit, the horse Olav Audunsson was riding. They praised the horse highly, and remarked how well groomed he was. And they teased Stein, who also had a white horse, but his was ill-kept and rusty yellow, and it was easy to see that he had been roughly handled by his rider. Stein said, "It has been Olaf's calling to break and tend horses. It's only right that a knight's horse should be well groomed. But wait till you have known a few years of husbandry. Then you will have forgotten all your courtly ways. Then you will acknowledge the truth of the old saying, that white horses and fair wives are not for country folk, for they have no time to watch them." "It will surely never go so hard with me that I have not the means to keep 2 white horses," said Olaf proudly. "Will you sell me the horse, Stein?" Stein named a price, and at once Olaf held out his hand and bade the others witness the bargain. It was settled on the spot how and when Olaf should pay over the purchase money. Stein took the saddle off his horse and went into the house to borrow a halter off Sire Benedict. The other men shook their heads, saying that this time Olaf had made a bad bargain. Olaf shrugged his shoulders and gave a little laugh. "I don't care always to be so thrifty as to split a louse into 4. He put his saddle on the horse he had bought and let Applevit trot behind. The other men stood and watched him. 1 or 2 of them gave a little sneering laugh. The first trial of strength between horse and rider came at the bend of the road. It looked as though Olaf would be well warmed before he reached home. Ingunn sat sewing alone in the hearth-room when she heard the beat of hoofs on the rocky floor of the courtyard. She went to the outer door and looked at her husband in surprise. In the rarefied autumn sunlight he was holding in a strange and restive horse. His face was fiery red, and both he and the horse were bespattered with the foam that covered the bridle, while the horse champed and pranced till the stony ground rang again and again, and would not stand still. Olaf greeted her and the housecarl, who came up with a laugh. "I will tell you all when I come in," said Olaf. He leapt from the saddle and stayed by the housecarl, who was to lead the new horse to the stable. "What is it?" she asked in wonder when he came in. He had stopped just inside the door, looking like a drunken man. "Is the old man at home?" asked Olaf. "No, he went down to the sea. Shall I send Tor for him?" Olaf laughed and closed the door behind him. Then he came forward, lifted his wife as one takes a child in one's arms, and squeezed her till she gasped. "Olaf! Olaf!" she cried in terror. "What has come over you?" "Oh, nothing else but that you are too fair a wife," he muttered with the same drunken laugh, and pressed his heated face against hers, till she thought he would break her neck. Late in the afternoon Olaf betook himself to the mill, and Ingunn went into the cookhouse. She had a pan of cheese standing by the fire below the bakestone. The lid could not have been fitted on tightly, so much ash had got in, and it smelt wrong, had doubtless stood too long, but it would not curdle sooner. Ingunn could never get her cheeses to work in the right way. The cheeses she had made the week before had gone soft again and run over onto the shelf where she had put them to dry. Her mouth twitched as she stood kneading the sticky, evil-smelling cheese in the pan with slow and clumsy hands. She was no skilful housewife. All work was to her heavy and difficult, and accidents were always happening. Each new misfortune made her so utterly despondent. When would it strike Olaf that his wife was incapable besides her other faults? At the end of a day like this, when everything she put her hand to had gone wrong, she felt bruised all over, as though from a number of falls. He had not been drunken after all, Olaf. At first she had sought comfort in the thought that he must have partaken more freely than was his wont of that ale of which their priest made such boast. But he had been quite sober, and her heart fluttered fitfully as she pondered what could have come over Olaf to make him so utterly unlike himself. Never had he been anything but kind and affectionate and tender in his love. At times she would rather have had him, well, not quite so calm and sober-minded. The thought weighed heavily upon her. True enough, he was calm in his bearing, master of himself, as long as might be. But she had seen occasions when he lost his self-control. And even in that night of madness, when the boy came to her and said he had slain Einar, she had felt his love for her as a safeguard. His rage she had seen once, when it was turned against herself. Once she herself had lain cowering, mortally afraid, face to face with his white-hot anger. It was a thing she could not bear to think of, and she had not thought of it till now. But now she recalled it, and with such stifling vividness. But now she could not have done anything to make him angry. She had felt so easy in these 4 months they had been married. Unconsciously she reckoned her marriage from the hour when her kinsman, in the presence of witnesses, had given her into the hands of Olav Audunsson. He had been so good to her that the memory of all the terrible things that had befallen her on the eve of that event was now but as the shadow of a horrible dream, and she had been obliged to acknowledge the truth of what he said. Hestviken was far away. It had been easier than she could ever have imagined to forget what had happened there in the north. But at the same time, she had striven to show him that she was grateful and loved him unspeakably. Surely then she could not have done anything to cause him to be so strange, just now when he came home. But then she was seized with terror at the thought of what might have caused it. And yet that was foolish, for he had shown no signs of wrath. It had all been caresses in a way, the whole of it, only wild ones. And then he had played with her roughly, mad with an ungovernable merriment that had scared her, for she was not used to seeing Olaf in this way. But perhaps that was no proof that anything out of the common had befallen him. Perhaps it was the way with all men, that such a fit came over them now and again. It had been Teet's way. Teet. She felt a kind of sagging at the heart. It had been just like Teet. Her memory of him had grown distant and unreal, like all the rest that sank below the horizon as she moved farther and farther away from it with Olaf. Now it had again come close to her, alive and threatening, the memory that she had been Teet's. She uttered a scream and started trembling all over as Olaf suddenly appeared just behind her. She had not noticed his coming. He had stood in the doorway for a while, watching her, the tall and slender young wife bending over the board, narrow-shouldered and lithe, working slowly and awkwardly with her long, thin-fingered hands in the mess of cheese. He could not see her face beneath the coif, but he had a feeling that she was in low spirits. He was ashamed of himself for the way he had behaved to her when he came home before. It was far from seemly for a man to show his wife such conduct. He was afraid she might feel insulted. "Have I frightened you?" Olaf spoke in his usual voice, calmly, with a shade of tender solicitude. He placed himself beside her, a little awkwardly, took a pinch of the curds she was now kneading into balls, and ate it. "I never did this work until I came here," she said in excuse. "Dala would never let me. Maybe I have not pressed out the whey enough." "You will learn it, I don't doubt," her husband comforted her. "We have time enough, Ingunn." "I was so vexed over that matter of the horse, but the man Stein provoked me to it." He looked down with embarrassment, turned red, and laughed with annoyance. You know it is not like me to make a fool's bargain. I was so glad when you came out to meet me." He looked at her as though begging forgiveness. She bent yet deeper over her work, and her cheeks flushed darkly. "She is not yet fit for much," thought her husband. "The unwanted labour tires her." If only the old man in the closet would keep quiet tonight. His poor frame was rent by rheumatic pains, so that he often wailed aloud for hours at night, and the young people got little rest. Olaf Ingolfsson had broken down completely as soon as his young kinsman had relieved him of the duties of master. He had worn himself out at Hestviken, though there was but little to show for it. Now he abandoned himself wholly to the afflictions of old age. The two young people were kind to him. Olaf felt it as a support, without being clear in what way he needed support, that after years of waiting he was living under the same roof as a man of his father's kindred. And he was glad that Ingunn was so kind and thoughtful in her manner toward the feeble old man. He had been a little disappointed that she seemed to like neither the daughters of Arn nor their father, whom they had since met. Olaf himself had a great liking for this cousin of his father's. Arn of Hestviken was a man of some 50 years, white-haired but handsome and of good presence. The family likeness between him and Olav Audunsson was striking. Arn Thorgilsson received Olaf very open-heartedly, and bade him be his guest at Yule. And for this Olaf had a right good mind. But Ingunn did not seem so set on going. But he was glad that in any case she seemed to take to Olaf Ingolfsson, though the old man gave no little trouble. He was often restless at night, and then he befouled the place with all the simples and unguents he prepared for himself. And the old dog, who lay in his bed at night and was to draw out the pain from his sick leg, was unclean, thievish, and cross-tempered. But Ingunn patiently assisted the old man, spoke to him gently as a daughter, and was kind to his dog. Both the young people found it diverting to listen to old Olaf's talk in the evenings. There was no end to what he knew of men and families and their seats in all the country round the Oslo fjord. Of all the warfare that followed Svea priests coming to Norway, he could tell them many tales learnt from his father. But in King Skjol's cause, Olaf half-priest had fought himself. Olav Audunsson's great-grandfather, Olav Olafsson of Hestviken, had followed Sigurd Ribbung to the last, and then he had fought against King Skjol. But when the Duke was proclaimed king of the Orthing, Olav Ribbung mustered men about him and marched northward with his 3 sons to offer him his support, and his brother, Ingolf the priest, gave his son leave to accompany his cousins. "We were then in our 15th year, Thorgils and I, but we gave a good account of ourselves. The scar I bear on my back was gotten at Laka. They made such sport of me, the Varbelgs, for getting hurt there. But we had come into a deep cleft with a stream between landslides, and had the birch legs above us, both behind and before. There were Thorgils and I, and 3 other lads. There were so many young lads among our party. One of them we called Surt, for he had the reddest hair I have seen on any man. It chanced, as we followed Gudin Geig into the eastern dales, that we lay one night at a little farm, and woke to find the house afire. "You have lain with your shockhead against the bare wall, you devil," said Gudin. "Yes, and then you blew on it," said Surt. His words were less decent than I will repeat for Ingunn's sake. We lay all over the floor, Surt just behind Gudin. The penthouse was all ablaze, but out we came and hacked our way through. They had an ill habit of setting fire to houses, the birch-legs. It was a jest with us that there were so many sons of the bathhouse carls and bakehouse wives among them. But now you are to hear how we fared, Thorgils and I, at Laka. No. First let me tell you a little of this Gudin Geig." Olaf noticed that it vexed Ingunn when the old man questioned her impatiently, whether she would not soon have news for them, now that she and Olaf had been married 5 months. "We do what we can, kinsman," said Olaf with a little laugh. But the old man was angry, and told him not to jest lightly with the matter, but rather to make vows, and pray God to grant them an heir betimes. Olaf laughed and thought there was no such haste. In his own mind he thought it hard enough for Ingunn, even now when she was in full health, to cope with the affairs of the household and keep her 3 serving women to their work. But Olav Ingolfsson complained. He believed he had not long to live. Now he had known 4 generations of the family, great-grandfather, grandfather, father, and son. I would fain greet a son of yours, Olaf, before I quit this world. You will surely live long enough to greet both my son and my grandson, Olaf consoled him. But the old man was despondent. Olaf Thorgilsson, who was the first man of our race here in Hestviken, was married to Tora Ingolfsdatter 10 years before they had children, and he fell before his sons saw the light. That was his punishment, to my mind, for having married her against his father's will. Ingolf of Hestviken and Thorgils of Differen had been enemies, but Olaf Thorgilsson said he would not forgo this good marriage just because 2 old men had quarrelled once in a drinking bout. Tora was the heiress here, for Ingolf was the last man of the old Hestvik line, who are said to have dwelt in this spot since there were men in Norway. And Thorgils Fievel was the last of the Baron's line at Differen. Sverre gave the manor and Thorgils' young widow to one of his own men. He had been thrice married, Thorgils Fievel. He had been given the name in his youth from his flaxen hair and the fine white skin, which has always been an inheritance in our kin. So, you may see, our ancestor had cause enough for vengeance upon Sverre, his manor, his father, and 3 brothers. And the winter that his wife perceived there was a hope that the race would survive them was the same winter when the country folk here around the Oslo fjord rose to take vengeance for Magnus, their crowned king, and strike down Sverre, who had no right to the kingdom and sought to upset all our ancient rights and bring in new customs which we did not like. Men of the Vik and of the uplands, of Ranrik and Elvesissel, well nigh the whole people of Norway were with us. Olaf Thorgilsson was among the nobles who were foremost in council and boldest in fight from the very first. You know how we fared at Oslo that time. The devil helps his own, and he bore up Sverre priest till he had him well housed within the gates of hell. That is my belief. Olaf Thorgilsson fell there on the ice. But some men from these parts rescued the body and carried him home. So many men had fallen above Olaf there around the standard that the birch-legs had not despoiled him, and home he came with his axe in his hand. They could not loosen the dead man's grip of the weapon. But when the widow came up and took hold of it, he let go. The arm dropped, and Tora was left holding the axe. And at the same moment, the child quickened within her. It was as though the unborn babe had struck out with his clenched fist, she told the sons she bore that spring. From the time they were big enough to understand, she spoke of this early and late, that they had vowed to avenge their father while they were yet in the womb. That axe was the one you have now, Kinfetch. Tora gave it that name. Of old it was called Wrathful Iron. It came to Olaf, since he was the elder of the twins, when she sent the boys to a man named Benedict, who was said to be a son of King Magnus Erlingsson. His was the first company in which these brothers took part. I can well call to mind my grandmother, Tora Ingolfsdatter. She was a large-hearted woman, of great judgment, feared God, and was charitable towards the poor. While she was mistress here, and she had a long life, Your great-grandfather and my father obeyed her to her dying day. There was great fishery here in Hestviken. Grandmother sent her ships along the whole coast, as far as the border by the Gauta River and down to Denmark. You can guess she spied out news of what was brewing against the race of Sverre. Tora always had scent of all such plans that were afoot, and all who were minded to oppose the Birchlegs found good backing with the widow of Olav Audunsson. Tora had loved her husband with marvellous devotion. Olav Audunsson was a little fair-skinned man, but full of strength and handsome. Somewhat lacking in chastity, but so they were, the men of King Magnus's time. Grandmother herself can never have been fair of face. At the time I remember her, she was so tall and so portly that she had to go sideways and bend double to get through the door here in the new house. She was half a head taller than her sons, and they were big men. But fair she was not. She had a nose so big and so crooked that I don't know what I can liken it to, and eyes like gulls' eggs. And her chins hung down upon her chest, and her breasts upon her stomach. First she sent her sons to Philippus, the Bagler king. But soon she grew very dissatisfied with him, deeming him lacking in energy, lazy, and a lover of peace. When, therefore, this Benedict came forward in the marches, she bade the lads go to him. His company was for the most part a rabble of vagabonds of every kind. My father always said that this Benedict was of little worth as a leader. He was rash and heedless, and somewhat foolish, sometimes a coward, and sometimes overbold. But Olaf held staunchly to him always, for he firmly believed that Benedict was King Magnus's son, though he did not come up to his father. Now it befell Benedict that at the first he had but this herd of rogues that they called the Ragged Host. But soon more and more good franklins took up his cause, since no more likely leader could be found at the time. But then they were minded to rule Benedict, and not let themselves be ruled by their claimant to the crown. And when, after a time, Sigurd Ribbung came forward and gained the support of the nobles, the old Bagler leaders, the chiefs of the Ragged Host, took Benedict with them, and went over to Sigurd, and Benedict had to content himself with being one of Sigurd Ribbung's petty chieftains. But Olafsson always bore in mind that Benedict was the lord to whom he had first sworn fealty, and served and honoured him accordingly. Olaf was a loyal man. Tora made good marriages for her sons, for Olaf, Astrid Helgesdatter of Mork. They were very young, some 16 years, both of them, and they had a goodly life together, and loved each other with true affection. Their sons were Ingolf, your grandfather. He was the eldest. Then there was Helg, who fell at Nidaros with King Skule, and Torgils. He was the youngest of the sons. He and I were of equal age. The daughters of Olaf and Astrid were Haldis, who was married to Ivar Stahl of Ars in Hudeheim, and Borgny, the nun, a lovable, holy woman. She died the year after you were born. Father was older when he married, for he wished to be a priest. It was the bishop himself, Nicolaus Arneson, who ordained him, and he loved my father very dearly. For father was exceeding pious and learned, and wrote books more fairly than any priest in the diocese. My mother, Berglot of Witt, was merry, fond of feasting and show, so she and father were ill-matched and did not agree well together, though they had many children. 5 of us lived to grow up. She was somewhat greedy of money, my mother. Father was so generous that he robbed his own larder behind mother's back to give alms. But it chanced unluckily that the townsmen got word of this and laughed at it. You know, it doesn't look right if a priest is not master in his own house. I remember one day, Mother was angry over something. She took 2 sheets of a book Father had just finished writing and threw them upon the fire. But then he beat her. Father was a big, strong, valiant man, and he had fought bravely against the Birchlegs. But toward his brother Christians he was the most gentle and peaceful of men. But with Mother there was always some dissension. Between our house at Oslo and the sea there was a peace. One could not call it ground. It was but beach and weeds and bare rock. The townspeople had been wont to use a path across it to shorten the way. Mother wished to close this path. Father thought it unseemly for a priest to wrangle over such a small matter. But there were quarrels without end on account of this right-of-way, between Father and Mother, and between us and our neighbours. When the order came that the priests of Norway were to live in celibacy as those of other Christian lands, Father bade my mother go home to Veit, to enjoy the manor and a great part of his estate. But she and her kinsmen and my brothers and sisters were very wroth, for they thought in their hearts that Father was more glad than sorry to be forced to break up their married life. I know full well that my father had always held the marriage of priests to be an evil custom, and that was also the opinion of Bishop Nicolaus. But it was the usage when my father was a young man, and then he had to do as his mother willed. My brothers and sisters and my mother then went up country, and I have not seen much of them since. Kar, my brother, got Veit, and Erland got Asheim. Now both the manors are divided among many children. I stayed with Father. I had always been intended for the priesthood, and Father and I lived happily together, and looked on Halvard's church as our true home. I was ordained subdeacon 3 years after King Skjul's fall. Grandmother Tora died soon after. But it was of your great-grandfather, Olav Ribbung, and his kin that I was to tell you. Ingolf, you know, was married to Ragnar Halkelsdatter from Karatorp. It was Tora who had busied herself to secure this good marriage for her grandson as soon as he was grown. Audun, your father, was already some 2 years old when we kinsmen set out to follow King Skjul and the Varbelgs. When Thorgils turned mad, Ingolf and Ragnar had an uneasy life at Hestviken, and afterwards they lived mostly at Karatorp. But one Yule, when they were here, Ingolf wished to accompany Haldis, his sister, and her husband across the fjord to Ars and to stay with them a while. They ran upon a rock, and all who were in the boat were drowned. Olav Ribbung bore this disaster so well that my father used to say he had never seen a man bear adversity so nobly. He always named his brother as a pattern of firmness and strength. Those twin brothers loved each other so dearly. It was his son and daughter and son-in-law who were lost. Olav merely said that he thanked God his mother and Astrid, his wife, had died before these disasters had fallen upon his children. He dwelt on there with the madman, and there were no others of his offspring left but Borgny the nun, and Audun, a little lad. Ingolf's widow married again in Elvesisl, and Olaf gave his consent that Audun should be brought up by his mother and stepfather. Olav Ribbung then adopted the son that Thorgils had gotten by a serving wench here in Hestviken, but the boy lived no long time. It was the 3rd year I was lame from my broken leg, when Ingolf and the others were lost, and I bore it ill. I thought it unbearably hard to be a cripple, young as I was, and that I could never be a priest. Then father always held up Olav Ribbung to me as an example. But I know that Olaf took it sorely to heart that Audun would not marry again after your mother's death, and would not bide at home in Hestviken. And the race bade fair to die out. But now there is good hope, I think, that it will thrive again, with such young and sound and goodly folk as you and your wife. And you may be well assured that I yearn to take a son of yours in my arms. 4 generations have I known, 5, if I may reckon our ancestress among them. Gladly would I see the first man of the 6th before I die. It is not given to many men to know their own kindred through 6 generations. And I would think it a reasonable thing, my Ingunn, if your husband too should conceive a great longing for the same thing. His departed kinsmen have possessed this manor of Hestviken since there were men in Norway. Do you hear that, young woman? He said, laughing to himself. Olaf saw how red she turned. But it was not the modest blush of happy longing. It was the hot glow of shame that mantled her face. Her eyes grew dark and troubled. In charity he looked away.